Well, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me welcome all of you here at the Russian International Affairs Council. We're grateful to everybody who managed to take part in this, I'm sure, very interesting and thought-provoking conversation. And let me just say a couple of words about the topic that we are going to discuss today. My take is that if you look at the broad variety of international issues that shape the foreign policy agenda of many countries in this century, definitely the relations between India and China stand out as one of the most important dimensions of contemporary world politics. If back in the 20th century we focused primarily on relations between major European countries, or later on between the Soviet Union and the United States, the future might well be defined by how Beijing and New Delhi are capable or not capable of managing their very complex, very multidimensional, and very comprehensive relations in future. There are many explanations trying to capture the roots of the problems between the two great Asian neighbors. Some would say that it's about geopolitics. The realist paradigm assumes that if you have two big powers close to each other, it is more or less inevitable that they enter into some kind of competitive, if not confrontational, relations with each other. So you might well look for explanations in the realist paradigm. On the other hand, if you look at the Indian-China relations in terms of the liberal paradigm, again, you can argue that the roots of the problems and disagreements are primarily in the political systems of the two countries. We are distinctly different from each other. You have India, which is regarded as the largest or biggest democracy in the world. On the other hand, you have China, which still sticks to its socialist social and economic system. And of course, you know, these are very serious differences that might or might not explain some of the problems that do exist in the relations between the two nations. If you take the civilizational paradigm, something that Huntington wrote about and others, again, you might argue that these are two distinctly different civilizations, though, again, in my personal view, it does not really explain why these two civilizations should necessarily consider each other to be opponents rather than partners. And finally, of course, you have the neo-Marxist, mostly economic paradigm, which is looking for problems primarily in economic interests of some major groups, be it in India or in China. My personal take is that none of these paradigms can possibly explain the relations between the two states, and definitely there should be something more to it. More not only to explain the current problems, but also explain the opportunities which do exist. Let me remind you that China surpassed the United States as the biggest single exporter to India. And if you look at the economic relations between the two nations, these are growing quite fast despite all the political problems and disagreements. You can also say that if you put aside the bilateral relations, the views from New Delhi and from Beijing on many matters related to the transformation of the international system are not really opposite to each other. And there are many similarities and many parallel ideas that should be taken into consideration. Of course, for us, for Russians, it's not an idle question. It is not something that we can discuss only as an issue of economic interest, but that has very practical implications for our relations with both countries. It is clear that Russia is not and cannot be interested in tensions between India and China. Both nations are important for the Russian foreign policy, and the worst case scenario for this country is that at some point Moscow will be forced to make a choice between the two. We do hope that it will never happen. At the same time, we have no illusions. We don't think that Russia is in a position to become an active mediator or even a facilitator for relations between two big Asian countries. It would be important, and I suggest if we look at the agenda of our today's meeting, we would like to focus primarily on three questions. This is about the quote-unquote significant other, to what extent China is important for Indians to define their identity, which is clearly different from other Asian nations, China included. It's also about the foreign policy implications of the comprehensive and sometimes quite difficult relations between India and China. And finally, of course, the role of Russia, if any. Can Russia make a difference? Can Russia be a constructive partner? Should Russia try to do anything, or it should keep this problem for the bilateral dimension of this relation? We can talk about interaction between India and China within SCO, within BRICS, within other multilateral structures. So we are privileged right now to have the author of a very interesting book which has just appeared, and definitely we need more literature on this relationship here. I hope that books like this one will be translated into Russian at some point and will be made available to students, educators, to researchers, and to everybody who is interested in any of the two countries. So without further ado, let me give the floor to the author of the book, and let me also extend our gratitude to you for taking the time and the effort to get here and to make this presentation possible. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Andrey Kortunov. Thank you, Julia, for taking care of this, and thank you for welcoming me on arrival. I saw the agenda, and there's just some preliminary remarks I want to make before I come to that, because some of the things are not explicit in the acknowledgement. So it's very important that I want to mention this, how the book was done. And I tried to get somebody to put together my pieces, my writings, those are published, and also the material I have researched, because it's just like a barber doesn't cut his own hair, he asks somebody else to do it. So I said, and then I did find a person who was at Fudan University, and she was very interested, and she has a background of India, US and China, and she said, you have a background of India, Europe and China, could do it. But then we had COVID, and then she had a kind of a breakdown and so on, she couldn't do it. Then I wanted somebody, and she was a good 20, 25 years younger than me. I was very keen that the person should be younger than me, so that the selections and the focus is for the next generation, not for our generation alone. So she couldn't get going with this. Then I tried another girl from Nepal. She's been working as a journalist in Delhi, and she looked at it and she said she's going back to Nepal. And then I found a young woman. She had done her Chinese studies in Jawaharlal University, language. She knew Mandarin, and she had gone to Austria to do her master's degree in international relations. And I was in Melbourne, my first visit. When I asked her should she be interested, she was very enthusiastic. I did everything to discourage her from doing this, because I said there is no money in it. There is neither fame nor money in this. It's going to be a lot of hard work. But she wouldn't be put off. And so the discussion went on, and then finally I told her to tell me in 100 words, with at least 3 good reasons, why she wants to take up this job, which will, till the book comes out, be a very miserable exercise for her. And she was convinced that she had to do it, and she took it up. And she must have been in her mid-20s. That was at the beginning. And then she did a lot of selections. I didn't remember many of the pieces I had written. So I said, you're supposed to use only my pieces. She says, no, it is all your pieces only, because I didn't remember, for example, that I was I had written about Vittoria De Sica's Bicycle Thief, So I'm also a film buff, so I follow these films. And it's a very typical economic story of the post-war world. The second thing was when I asked a friend who was my colleague in Beijing, Pamela Toby, design the cover. She's been designer of the Washington Post for 30 years. And then she was working in Beijing with the China International Publishing Group, for whom I had started this journal called China-India Dialogue. And so first she sent me samples about, I don't remember, 12, 15 or 18 of them, was all dragon and tiger. So I said, Pam, I'm not using this dragon and tiger metaphor, it's not there. She said, really, but I can't believe it. I've yet to come across a book which doesn't do that. And so then I said, yes, can you please redo it again? She did it with great enthusiasm, and she's very happy. Everybody's happy with the cover, that it doesn't have that dragon and tiger or dragon and elephant kind of thing. So why I mentioned this is that from the very beginning in this book, my attempt has been to break out of the mold. And when I say not only in the focus and generation of content, but also in the way I go about it. So at one level, it was journalism, which has made this possible for me. And when I say journalism, it was not about just taking the matter that is there. It's not a question of what is happening, reporting it. It was a question of how does one retell stories? How do you redefine stories that have been told? How do you take the same narrative and come to a different conclusion? Just like when you said about how we can look on the bright side of opportunities and so on. And I knew it was a very, very risky proposition to attempt in India, because as a former Foreign Secretary, Mr. Ranjan Mathai says here, I have taken the comments of all these people as they had given it to me. I have known some of them, I have worked with them, they have briefed me off the record, everything over the years. So they said, you take what you want to change something, you just let us know, we have no objection, it has to go with what you want. So for instance, he says, while not everyone may agree with efforts at objectivity in explaining India's difficulties with China, but for me, I cannot make a departure from objectivity to explain anything as a journalist. And even the very first quotation by Lalit Mansingh, who was a very, very well-known diplomat and was India's Foreign Secretary, Ambassador to Washington, and one of the first Asian members on the Board of Trustees of the International Crisis Group. He also says that Shastri Ramachandaran's experience of working with leading Chinese newspapers during his successive spells in Beijing explains his perspective on India and China and why it is often at variance with other China specialists. So it is assumed that there must be a particular pattern, and that if there is a break in the pattern, then people are looking at, not exactly saying what is wrong with this guy, but just saying, okay, raise the question of why it is different. Does it need to be different? And is there a case for objectivity when you are looking at interests of India's foreign policy and national security? But for me, when I was writing in Beijing, I made a conscious effort that both these are developing countries. I have seen both of them attend this G7 and G8 meetings, where neither of them speak up for the developing countries. What is the purpose served of these countries going to the high table if they are going to deal with the problems of the G7 countries? It is their problem they should take to that table to be resolved. So, for instance, so I tried to write certain pieces which would be common for both an Indian newspaper and a Chinese newspaper like Global Times. So one of the pieces was the Bhopal gas leak, where you had an industrial disaster. And I said, you look at it, that neither India nor another developing country, China, has ever raised it in public. Whereas when British Petroleum, they leaked oil in the Gulf of Mexico, without a whimper, they paid up $20 billion. You know, they didn't have any debate or discussion about it. Whereas what happened in Bhopal was in stark contrast to that. So I said these are all common interests. And from this, my premise is that India and China have more common interests and shared concerns than bilateral differences. Their bilateral differences are not and have never been such as to subsume common interests. And throughout the book, I look at what are the common interests of the two countries. So, before I come to the main agenda, when you spoke about opportunities, I want to draw out that actually in the last September, 8-9 months, there have been a lot of positive developments. And there are some things that can be said but should not be said, and some things that should be said but I cannot say it. But I think we'll all understand what I'm speaking about. That there is not only the issue of domestic politics and domestic pressures, there are also international politics and pressures on a country like India, like there is on any other country, including China. So, actually, no country, especially a country with diverse interests like India or China, they really don't enjoy absolute strategic autonomy. No, it's not possible. One can use the term strategic autonomy, but these are all come with a number of caveats. Without that, it is not possible to exercise strategic autonomy. So, since last year, there have been some very low visibility black channel talks, because till May, for the whole of 23, there was no Chinese ambassador in India. From October 2022 till June or July this year, there was no Chinese ambassador. And then there were some talks after more than a year. And earlier this year, sometime in January or probably even December 23, there were some back channel talks about we should improve relations and so on. And then names were announced, floated, the ground was tested, trial balloons were kind of around for a while, and then a new ambassador has taken charge in July. Now, sorry, excuse me. Around the time when he was to take charge, soon after he took charge, soon after the elections, there's a very, very important development. And rarely do I think has India's foreign policy been so central an issue in the economic survey. This is probably, to my recall, the first time that the economic survey, which is presented a day before the annual budget in India, had a clear focus by the chief economic advisor, who said that we need to get probably more investment from China, even if it is to produce goods for other countries. So this was a...
Is falling.
Sorry?
The GI has been
Yes,
falling.
yeah. So
for India,
yeah.
And globally, but for India as well.
Yes. So this is there in the report, and most of the economists, I think after Mr. Raghuram Rajan and Arvind Subramanian, the chief economic advisors for the first time, they have been mostly corporate economists, you know, which is again something, a very big departure from the Indian tradition. So here you had a corporate economist who was saying we need to get investment from China so that to build up our manufacturing capacity and to export to US and other countries. And this was another version of China plus one. It was China and one it was becoming. So soon after this happened, the Commerce Minister said no, there is no change in the policy, and it is on a case-by-case basis that we grant licenses or permission for Chinese industries and this thing, and there is no change. Now, the very important thing, everything that India and China do cannot be publicly explicitly stated. More in the case of India than in the case of China. In the case of China, there is a lot of opacity even otherwise, because of the way it functions, but things cannot be kept under a wrap for a long time. It may be stated, it may not be stated. But there is a clear understanding of why certain things are happening. So even though the Commerce Minister had said this, then there were trade delegations which went from India to China. And their idea was to tell the Chinese that you have to do something to balance the trade deficit. So they had gone there, they came back. And why? Because in the last few years, there's a lot of equipment that have been imported from China, which is lying in India. 60% of India's electrical and electronic imports are from China. The equipment is there, but there is nobody to run these machines. So you need the Chinese to come in, both technicians and workmen and experts. And unless they are given what they call streamlined visas to come for this, this may not happen. So finally they have agreed to do that. So this is one part of it. So this is at the level of trade, and industrialists are actually demanding publicly that we need to have things from China. So I think in a sense that this is a very, very important development when you speak of opportunities. That the relationship has reached a point where you cannot suppress the public expression of opportunities that are available, and that needs to be utilized. And second and more, in this book also I say, if there are two classes of people who don't criticize China, it is businessmen and politicians. Because businessmen want to get on with business, and politicians know that they have.
So it's journalists and army people.
Yes.
And you are one of the few journalists who
yes.
is objective.
So you have these now trade bodies are openly saying we should import from China, let Chinese technicians come. This development has been going. Although publicly they will say, oh, we can't have, there are limitations, they can't give them, there are security, all these usual things are said, but there is a new track that has opened. The other thing before that 4 years after the India-China military clash in eastern Ladakh in Galwan, which was the worst crisis after 62. This is the first time that there is a thaw in the relationship. And there is a kind of a warming up of the two countries.
Starting in
yeah,
year,
there is a recognition that we cannot let the history of the context of the particular military clash stand in the way of our relationship in other sectors. There is a recognition of it, and they are working towards actualizing it. So that is happening. And very interestingly, two former foreign secretaries who are associated and are known for their reading of situation in China. One is Vijay Gokhale. He was ambassador to China. He retired as foreign secretary. He runs a think tank in Pune called Pune International Center. He is one of the trustees. He had written an article in a newspaper where he has said, keep your enemy closer. And there the argument was that increasingly because of this whole thing that you can't have violence on the border and then talks at the table. So his answer to that was there may be a lot to be said in favor of not having talks with a country with whom there is an unresolved dispute, but the danger of not talking are greater than the dangers of talking. So, and when he wrote something like this, and it was widely quoted, including by international agencies, a lot of others, then you know that it is a considered kind of expression of an opinion, not just an individual writing a whimsical piece. It is far, far more than that, otherwise he would not have done it. The second person to similarly come out in favor of China and explain how that there is a case for re-engaging China in India is Mr. Shyam Saran, who is also former foreign secretary. And in the view of many people, he is India's leading scholar diplomat on China. And he's also written the foreword for my book. And he is a person who is all, but his saying it now means his reading of the situation makes him feel that he has to come out with his opinion. He may have always held his opinion that we should engage with China. So which means India is moving away from the much articulated position of the last few years, saying that first they said disputes must not differences must not become disputes. But now differences have become disputes because they say there has been a military clash. So this has now been put behind, because another interesting development was when India's Foreign Minister Jaishankar and China's Wang Yi, Foreign Minister and State Councillor, they met recently on the sidelines of a Asia-Pacific conference in Laos. What they said was, we need strong guidance to improve the relationship. Now the reading of this is that they are looking for strong political guidance. So hence the conclusion of many people, and the very, very important thing which Modi himself, the Prime Minister himself, had said before this. Speaking in April, this whole process of reinvigoration of India-China engagement began after the Prime Minister said that our relationship with China ties are important and significant. This is the first time he said something like this explicitly by naming the country after 2020. He said this in April, and this has come alongside this other movement of the ambassador coming in and so on. And so what I'm saying is that there is a new India-China playbook that is getting written, that is in the process of getting written now. And when both these ministers say that we want strong guidance, the expectation is that they may perhaps meet. And if they meet, it will be in Russia, where you have the BRICS summit. So again, there also the importance of Russia is not incidental. They could have met before, they could have met after, they could have met otherwise. So that is not happening. So now I will come to the points that you have wanted me to capture here. And now, it is actually two countries are very, very important to India's national identity. It is both China and Pakistan. And Pakistan has always, in both sides of the border, in the capital of Pakistan and in India, and not now, not 10 years before, for much longer than that, you have had leadership in both countries trying to project themselves as saviors of their respective country from the threat posed by the other. In recent years, one of the most important developments has been that foreign policy has become a matter of domestic politics. There is almost no election since 2002 when the neighborhood, especially Pakistan, Bangladesh, and even Afghanistan, and the Muslim community has not been a part of electoral politics, but also drawing threads from foreign policy and India's external relations. And this does not always make sense. For instance, when they said India will give citizenship to minorities from other South Asian countries, it meant only Afghanistan, Pakistan and Bangladesh. And everybody said, oh, but Hindus are a minority, they need to. But I said, if assuming the Indian state is seriously concerned about Hindus in the neighborhood, then the largest population of Hindus is in Sri Lanka. Why was Sri Lanka ignored? Nobody, even I wrote a column and everybody, there's a lot of howls of protest that, Sri Lanka is different, it is not like India, Pakistan. So this kind of perception has been there. And this is very much linked to, there's also a north-south divide in India. So you have the northern part, the Gangetic belt, and then you have the southern part of India, the Dravida part of it, which has more a tradition of written languages, All the languages have a script in the southern states, which is not the case for all the states in the north. And you may have a script that has been manufactured later to write Hindi or any of these languages. But traditionally, these languages have not had a script. So this is one divide. So you have the kind of othering of Pakistan, and following from that, in the last particularly 4 years, the othering of China also. And here the othering has also got, what shall I say, it's become more provocative. Like there is clear evidence that Jawaharlal Nehru made a mistake in the 60s with his forward policy, which is what provoked Mao Zedong to kind of provoke a war in 1962. Similarly now, there is a conclusion that the same conflict has been provoked by this government in 2020. Why? Why has China chosen this military conflict? Now, there are a number of reasons that can be given. The first and most important is that, oh, we'll teach them a lesson, we'll teach the Chinese a lesson. You know, it feeds into this narrative that is there in India. Oh, this government will teach the Chinese a lesson, they will teach Pakistan a lesson, they will teach Bangladesh a lesson. This new India is a muscular, militarized India. This was never the case before. You know? So this is the first one, which is a matter of a national identity, an identity which is perceived in terms of a way of life being, what shall I say, reinforced, and in my opinion, falsely, as a religion. Because it has been the opinion of the Supreme Court and many people in India that Hinduism is not a religion, it is a way of life. So, to then from that bring Hindutva and conflate it with a religion and not even the sectarianism of a particular religion is definitely the kind of manifestation of the new national identity that India is trying to carve itself out. And you can also see this when there are, what should I say, very shrill noises from India. When other countries are involved, whether it is Canada or UK, all these countries, if there is conflict, there is friction, there is tension, and there is more talk of the Hindus there being affected. So, this national identity in a country, and this is very new to Asia, because even if you look at the traditional authoritarian or dictatorial governments in Asia, like Singapore or Malaysia, any of these people, they have always privileged diversity over democracy. Because long before any countries came to know of constitutional democracy, you had diversity. So it is a pre-constitutional condition. And for the first time, one finds that in a country where the constitution is only about 75 years old or less, this is being now sought to be changed. So this is a kind of, what should I say, a new identity, one can say, that is being fabricated or that is being manufactured, and one does not know where this will lead, not only India as a country, where it will lead its domestic policies, what changes it will bring about in its constitution, and how it will affect foreign policy, especially in the neighborhood. Because this has been injected into the neighborhood policy. When you say you will give citizenship to minorities from Afghanistan, Pakistan and Bangladesh. And the other thing which people have pointed out, even those who support this national identity, they say no, but our identity, the thread of our identity in the region are strengthened by having these minorities, Hindus, continuing to live in those countries, you know, because that is more essential to sustain the identity rather than bring it over here and snuff it out. And when I've traveled to the northwest frontier of Pakistan and everything, I've come across Sikhs and all that. They say, no, we want to live here. You know? So this is the issue of identity. Then, along with this identity, there is a refusal to recognize Pakistan for being what it is. One is Pakistan does not have a history, because this history begins only in 47. So it does not have a history that predates 1947. And Pakistan is a very complex state, you know. You don't have any kind of nationalism there. Actually, one could say that army alone represents a kind of nationalism there. You have regional conflicts, the Balochis, the Sindhis, the Pashtuns, the Punjabis, all these people. But you can't say that there is a nationwide kind of nationalism built on either language or a particular culture or a political trend. And the other important thing which I researched a lot when I was in China, I have not brought all of it into this because I did not want to focus on that, that China is more than a pawn. I mean, Pakistan is more than a pawn of China. Pakistan is not just a cat's paw which China can use and withdraw at will. No, that is not the case. Because you can see in a number of situations Other than India, Pakistan alone has a lot of access and influence in the Anglo-American axis. And for long years you will find that in spite of its size being so much smaller than India, it has managed to get billions of dollars worth of military equipment from the US. And even in the last 20 years, a lot of money given for development till 2010 and then even till 20 were for weapons and so on. And these are all camouflage, they said it is for development. So this kind of disproportionate investment of the US in Pakistan. And Pakistan has been useful for China in pursuing China's interests with the Arab states in the Organization of Islamic Conference. The House of South is protected by a division of the Pakistan Army. So is the King of Bahrain. And there have been written accounts that Pakistan's ISI and section of the top generals are the ones who kind of regularly calibrate what you call the Praetorian Guard of many of these Arab states and so on. So one cannot ignore this altogether. And so this can, it is surprising here that when you look at national identity, it does not come into a clash when the Arab states are involved. India's national identity of being a Hindu majoritarian one is asserted only when it comes to Pakistan and Bangladesh and to some extent Afghanistan, but never when it comes to the Arab states. This is again a recognition of the economic compulsion and strategic because we have millions of people working in those countries. More than 34 million people are there. Now, if all of these people were to come back, it would create serious problems. So this is somewhere where we don't speak of this Hindutva identity. So the identity is very clearly used to say that this muscularity, this new India, its assertiveness is rooted here against our immediate enemy, which is Pakistan and China, in that order. Because China is again, it doesn't evoke the kind of hostility that Pakistan does in India. So Pakistan has always had that issue. And the second thing, very unfortunate thing, beyond a point, even the political leadership doesn't want that to happen. Because many Indians cannot distinguish citizens of their own country from the northeast, especially states like Manipur, from the Chinese. If they see them in a train or the airport, they say, no, these are Chinese. And this is a shocking thing. It's a different matter that even many educated Indians cannot distinguish a Korean from a Thai or a Thai and a Korean from the Chinese people. But that you take many of the people of your northeast to be Chinese. This is one. The second and more fraught consequence of this kind of national identity, even if it is only occasionally pulled out of the bag of political tricks, is that you have a lot of these Taiwanese companies also on the outskirts of Delhi, which are like Foxconn and all these people manufacturing their business. Now, when these people attack them, some people have been taught, they don't know the difference between Chinese, mainland Chinese and Taiwan Chinese. They don't know the difference between Hong Kong Chinese and Singapore Chinese. So I think beyond the point, this will create law and order problems, and it will affect not only the image of the government, but also any attempt to bring in investment from these countries. So I think they are having to retreat on that. So on the issue of national identity, one can say that the self-perception, which I have said more than once, the muscular new India that tries this thing, and this is kind of rooted in domestic policies, which is asserted in foreign policy as well. This is how I would summarize that part of it. Then, China and Indian media discourse. This is something I have dealt with. Actually, I have written 2 papers. Only one part of it has been published here. That is how Indian media deals with, let us say, our largest neighbor, which is China, and our smallest and poorest neighbor, Nepal. And I was very shocked when I came back from China, And I had even editors of English papers, columnists telling me, no, but why should we fear China? They come here. Suppose we don't, they allow China to open this ICBC bank, why should we allow that? People are saying this in 2012 and 2014. I was in China. ICBC was the world's largest bank after the financial crisis. First, 6 of the top 10 banks were Chinese banks, then 4. Then they say, no, we should not allow these Chinese goods. What are these Chinese goods these people are talking about? Those are those small electric bulbs, which, let us say, Philips or Awesome are selling their bulb for 400 rupees. This Chinese make come for 90 rupees. And they last just as long. And the third thing which they have not admitted is a number of big Indian companies. Number of big ones. The brands. The product comes from China. Electrical appliances. And it is only branded in India. And this has never been publicized. And many people don't want to do it. Then there is also a lot of business deliberately kept under the radar, which media doesn't look at, and thankfully I am glad they don't look at it. Like the amount of garment trade between China and India is huge, really huge. Garment. Mainly t-shirts. T-shirts, yeah. And for instance, when they introduced the flight to Kunming, Calcutta to Kunming, they introduced a flight once a week, then it became, I think, twice a week, then maybe sometimes it was, I think, every 2 days or something. Every flight was coming back with about 30 or 35 what I call the new class of business travelers. Those are people you pick up locally, you take 30, 35 of them, they will all go there. The t-shirts come from Guangzhou to Kunming, they are kind of offloaded, made into small packages of 30 kgs, which these guys bring back, and then they go into the Kidarpur market in Calcutta and to other neighboring streets. So asking these guys how much, they said, no, we sell it for 100 rupees, but even for as low as 70 rupees, we'll still get some profit. And this is huge, actually. And I met Pranab Mukherjee when he was foreign minister once, so I asked him how this is happening. He said, no, no, don't talk about it, don't write about it. So there is a thing like these things have been going on. But, so, Indian media is more preoccupied with China than China is Chinese media with Indian media. You will find, for instance, I will refer to that portion on the 60th anniversary of the 62 war. And Shiv Shankar Menon himself said, who was ambassador to China, who knows China better than many other people in the world. He said one doesn't know what is fact, what is fiction, what is fantasy, where history begins, where their fantasies end. So it's hard to say. But India is obsessed with the belief that China is obsessed with it. It is not. Throughout my 1 year in Global Times, the first 1 year, there was not a single piece about India in the Global Times. Of course, many people mistakenly said it's a new paper, you are there, that's why they didn't. I think if the Chinese wanted to write something, it would hardly matter to them that I am an employee of the newspaper.
Because it's more political.
Sorry?
It's more political in China. There is no such loud media in China.
Yeah.
It's a political line and
yes.
you don't want to share.
Yeah, no, it's a state organ. And surprisingly, for all this obsession with the Chinese media, they're ever able to, the Indian establishment or even the media is never able to read the messaging carried out function of the state media. For instance, when Indian Prime Minister Modi went to meet Xi Jinping, I think this was in Tashkent for the SCO summit, and Chinese media repeatedly kept saying, I was in Beijing, China Radio International, CCTV, Global Times, People's Daily, China Daily, that no purpose will be served by Prime Minister Modi meeting him because this kind of personalization will not work and the nuclear suppliers group will decide this, and it is not dependent on one country. But because they had built up a narrative saying one country is stopped our membership, one country, they had to keep this up. They went, and then afterwards, even the foreign secretary said privately, why could we not read? The Chinese media was not attacking Modi. They were trying to drive home the point that no purpose will be served, the state media, by the Indian Prime Minister coming, and we should avoid any embarrassment consequences that will flow from such high expectations. This is what the media was messaging. But this was not read. So on the one hand, India is obsessed, and every day you will find things about China in Indian media. Every day there is something. So this kind of obsession that, oh, Chinese, they're involved in a lot of criminal activity, mobile phone scams and all. It may all be true, but the Chinese state is not the one which is actually doing all this. The fact of people being Chinese and doing something criminal doesn't mean the Chinese state is doing this on a day-to-day basis. So Indian media has not been able to kind of, they don't have a discourse actually. When you say on this thing, they have a kind of, what shall I say, that you have, if you write something on China, it has to be negative. So I've had colleagues with me, very senior, very respected colleagues who know China well, and when I ask them, but why have you written this in the Economic Times? He said, Shastri, if I don't write this, no, they don't publish it. So I'm 65, I have to publish at least one piece a month. So I write this thing. So they said, but this is not wrong. This particular fact may not be wrong, but the way you have conflated it with so many other things is an entirely different spin on the whole thing. So this is there. The second thing is that, again in the media, as in domestic politics and foreign policy, there are powerful international players shaping public opinion. And there is no room for any kind of unbiased writing on China free of prejudice. So that is why when Vijay Gokhale or Shyam Saran come out after so many years and say there is a case for re-engagement, it makes one sit up, because they have not said this for 4 years, except in private conversations or among people like us and so on. So I would say that the Indian media has failed in its job, and it has failed in an abysmal sense, because the job of the media is to project a reality. And that is as close to the truth as possible, and with facts, if that is practicable. That by doing this, India will never understand what is China. It will be like the story we have of 5 blind men and the elephant, how they describe it. So you will find almost identical the reports in all these newspapers. So this is what I would say, the Indian media discourse is neither enlightening, nor is it instructive, nor does it create the way for dialogue. It only panders to prejudices, negative perceptions of China, and lastly, it kind of never misses an opportunity to kind of stoke conflict and prejudice. This is how I would summarize the role of the Indian media. And quickly now, I think I've overshot the time a little bit. Now, India and China in the international arena, visions of the future world order, regional and macro-regional, the Belt and Road Initiative. So the Belt and Road Initiative, I think the question that you have posed remains, whether it is a threat or a missed opportunity. Because there are a section of foreign ministry officials who say we are not opposed to the Belt and Road Initiative, but we are opposed to wherever it transgresses on Indian territory. So it's only a territorial issue. But till that is resolved, we don't want to comment on Belt and Road Initiative favorably or otherwise. But it is very clear that India does not want to be engaged in any way with a kind of a broad platform of cooperation with China. Because more than the Belt and Road Initiative, you had something called the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar Forum, which was all these 4 countries, and which had kind of, what shall I say, a greater salience for the region. But this has been allowed to fall by the wayside. And there are many China scholars, especially people like Patricia Oberoi, who say we should be worried more about BCIM being buried than about Belt and Road Initiative. I tend to agree with that, because Belt and Road Initiative again means an extension of domestic politics and territorial questions. And in terms of visions of the future world order, increasingly many liberals in India are coming around to the view that the new axis of power, the emerging axis of power in the new world order will be to the east of the Mediterranean. And there have been very credible research reports and everything and the process of de-dollarization. It may not be very much, but in less than 2-3 years, it has come from 71% to only 58% of dollarization is there. So it is gradual, it is falling. All the countries are kind of reducing their assets in dollars. It cannot be done overnight because China is the biggest holder of US Treasury bonds. So these things will take time. And every country is waiting to watch the move of the other countries because they cannot overnight get into a confrontation with the Western Bloc or the so-called international community. Because I think the big difference will be if Saudi Arabia decides to trade with China in yuan. That will be the first formal blow to the US dollar. Otherwise, till then the US, this thing will stand regardless of their misuse of this, what do you call that, the SWIFT code and international transfer arrangements and kind of capturing the assets of other countries, violation of this kind of sovereignty. Those things will continue, and I don't think any country, including India, will take a stand on which side they are until they know it is a breaking point. Now, there is a large section of people in India, including intelligentsia, who feel that we should have this troika of Russia, India, China. But whether it will happen or not remains to be seen. Because, see, with Russia, India, of all the countries, it is only with Russia that India has something like a friendship. It predates this whole time of transactional politics, And, sorry, I think my jacket is making me very warm.
I think you can add Japan to this list as well. There is a very special relation between India and Japan.
So, I think that every time there is a challenge to the question of what is India's relationship with China, the government of India doesn't go very far out to dispel any impression or disabuse impressions that are created. But when it comes to Russia, it is always quick, to eliminate any impression of weakening of the friendship. And one should see Prime Minister Modi's visit to Ukraine as I would attribute it to optics. It was felt necessary to show, and otherwise a statement like saying we are not neutral, we are for peace, not war. It doesn't explain how it makes you neutral first. And there are many people who don't agree with the proposition that this is not an era of war. Of course it is an era of war. What is happening? Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Somalia, Libya, Syria, it is occupied. So, and again, everybody will, just like you quote Mao's, that first sentence, that power comes through the barrel of a gun. But the second and more important part of that sentence is that therefore at all times the party must be in control of the army. That part of it is forgotten. In the same way, Modi said this is not an era of war. So he wants to understand what are Russia's compulsions, So that part of it is never this thing. It is being made out as if it is a very profound, statesmanly kind of thing, which is found by, if you take it in isolation. But his going to Ukraine, I don't think it has received the kind of, what shall I say? There is always a buzz, when he goes to US or Russia. There is no such buzz when he goes to Kyiv. That's all I would say. There's something he had to do.
First time.
There's nothing to, no harm done. Yes. And actually a lot of fanatics, blind followers, whose literacy is very low, who may not even know where is Ukraine or Russia, they have started even more than a year ago that Prime Minister Modi has stopped the war. That he stopped the war. So why it is going on? They say, no, this is all propaganda. So they have this large kind of blind following. This is very important in domestic politics because it's not just the BJP, but at least 20% of the votes that come to the BJP are personal votes for Modi. This is really extraordinary. So I think I have more or less touched on all the aspects, and I'm sorry to have exceeded the time you allowed me. So please.
Well, thank you for your great presentation. I think that in many ways it is an eye-opener. I don't want to engage right now myself into a discussion, though I have a lot to say about the Chinese media, and I think that I take a more critical approach than you do, because I work with Chinese media quite a lot, and they have their own limitations. Not everybody, but of course, if you compare the mainstream China media to more liberal, you'll see a lot of differences. But I don't want to abuse the right to lead this discussion. I think that Lydia wanted to ask something or to make a statement.
Switch on, but I hope you can hear me. Okay, just in case it helps, I'll keep it here. A very warm welcome. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll enjoy reading the book. Great overview. Thanks a lot. What I wanted to comment is maybe to give you a Russia perspective on the relations. Is it better?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Russia, India, China, the triangle. It was introduced by a commission, Foreign Minister Primakov, I think in '98 or '99, very long time back. And the relations between Russia and China since then progressed immensely. But the relations between Russia and India are equally important.
Yes.
And whenever we speak about relations between Russia and India, we hear how India is hurt by the proximity between Russia and China.
Yes.
We hear it all the time. And this hurts the relations between Russia and India a lot. While the balance between the three is indispensable to Russia's understanding of Eurasian security, for instance. So good relations between India and China are of paramount importance to Russia. I would say that Dr. Kortunov has been very diplomatic in saying that we try not to influence or not to mediate.
Yes.
If we could, we would love to do it actually, but we're just being very careful, respecting the sensitivities on both sides. So good relations between China and India are extremely important to Russia. I would overemphasize this. And as you rightly touched upon it, the real danger is that these relations would be interfered with by the West. Because it can be so easily shaken, the entire Eurasian security at the heartland of Eurasia can be just shaken up by any further conflict between India and China. We in Russia understand it very well. And we watch these relations very carefully and with a lot of interest and a lot of, I would say, passion, actually. So when Foreign Minister Jaishankar visited Moscow, many of us here had the privilege of meeting him in person, where he shared his personal views with us. And at that, it was in December 23.
Yes.
At that time, we could hear him saying with some pain about the difficulties between India and China. So it was December 23. Then the big milestone was, I think, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Astana, where Prime Minister Modi didn't come, which was in Russia perceived as the sign that the relations are very bad between China and India. Then came the summit when Prime Minister Modi visited Moscow. It was very cordial, very good sign of genuine atmosphere between the two countries. Even the visit to Ukraine was taken well because it happened downplayed somewhat because it came after the visit to Moscow, which was important. And then comes this détente between India and China. We hear that in diplomatic circles and in business community in India, there is really the improvement of perception of China. Maybe something happened in negotiations. There was some breakthrough about, the way the armies would function on the border, etc. Hopefully, and we're of course very hopeful about the BRICS summit that is coming in Kazan, where hopefully both Prime Minister Modi and the Chinese leader would come, and hopefully it would serve as a platform for this much anticipated BRIC cooperation. And my question is, maybe just slightly provocative, is it a coincidence that your objective book, which is absolutely unusual for the Indian scene, comes at a time when the turn happens, when the relations improve so much? Or was it a carefully, is it a coincidence, or was it carefully orchestrated moment for this book to come out, to play a positive role?
Thank you. Thank you, because they liked it. A lot of people have liked the book because we don't have something like it. There is criticism also, I welcome this criticism there. But at least one person who's serving as a secretary in the ministry, he's also written of why it is important. The second, this one point where a lot of people disagree, where I would like to know what Russia thinks of, is this Galwan. Why it happened? For me, the most plausible and possible reason it could have happened is this is China's way of establishing deterrence, or trying to make the point that there is no nuclear deterrence between India and China, first thing. The second thing, because this is something a lot of defense experts, especially in Russia, would have studied, is this happened in 2020. Soon after that, or just a little before, that same year, in March, you had this US fighter craft in the Taiwan Strait. And after the Pacific Fleet had come in there. And then two Chinese planes kind of went and encircled them. The US plane did not retaliate, but it retreated. So there is also a conclusion which has been published by US analysts saying that China has established deterrence against the US in the Pacific. And they say this is deterrence against India. So, which people have disagreed with my thing, but even those who disagree, particularly one Mr. Vivek Kadju, who retired as Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, he says for all that, this book is a thought challenge and it must be read by anyone who feels they need to know more about the number one security and foreign policy challenge. So, and the other thing which people have pointed out is that I have not dealt with the boundary issue in great detail. I have not dealt with the boundary issue, I have mentioned it in passing. I have mentioned the meeting of the things. Why? Because the boundary issue is one, it's an industry by itself. You can go on writing, producing books about it. First and foremost, you are only going to take statist positions of both the states and look at what has happened, what has not happened, why it has happened, why it has not happened, what could have happened. You know, it doesn't go beyond this speculative, conjectural and potential of what could be done. But it is ultimately the state and the political leadership who will take a decision whenever it becomes. As of now, I don't think the boundary question is either going to be taken up or going to be resolved. And I think China tried its best, which I have said it, in 2015, when Modi was visiting China, his first visit. They had invited me before his visit, spoke to several people. So they had this whole media writing, no, he's a very strong leadership, both countries have very strong leaders, so this is the time to resolve the boundary issue. But I don't think public opinion in India is ready to resolve the boundary. They will not accept any compromise on that. And they're not even talking about it. Please.
See, is it work? Try again. Okay, it works. So, I want to thank organizers for conducting such an event, also for coming here, Mr. Ramachandaran, and for presenting your book and your views on the agenda, as well as on the overall situation in India-China relations. And I would paradoxically start with summing up. I should say that I was really impressed by your book and impressed by your analysis, well-balanced one, very nuanced, and by your good knowledge of China, which is hardly met in Indian expert community, with all respect to that. Yeah, and I hope that your book will contribute to further discussion in Indian, so at least expert circles, policymakers circles, and you could, you in India could frame a better strategy to deal with those issues you called in the book. And for discussion, anyway, I wanted to put a rather provocative, probably provocative take, and my take would concern moving beyond binaries, as you put it in your book. And I do agree with you that India-China relations are full of binaries, mostly negative. But I wonder, what if you could left behind the structural binary? The structural binary, titled, which titles your book. I mean, this structural role of India-China relations in the whole foreign policy of New Delhi. So, because I think that Indian obsession with China, whether negative or positive, does not contribute to manifesting Asian century. In fact, India could, follow China's path. I'm not an expert on China. I took, there's takes from your book and from my observations and reading colleagues who concentrate on China. And India could follow China's path by not by pretending not to, put a premium on India or on any other center of power instead of probably Americans. Yeah, and probably Indian primacy and Indian Asian century, as you put it in your book, could not be found in constant comparing with China, but in Indian self-sufficiency and Indian concentration on all other vectors of foreign policy, be it Russia, be it US, be it China, of course, Africa, Southeastern Asian nations, or whatever, could be more productive in reaching this Asian century than concentrating on India-China relations. And that was my main take concerning the first point of agenda. And I would just comment on your statements concerning Belt and Road Initiative and my beloved Pakistan, of course. When it comes to Belt and Road Initiative, I think that we are not dealing with the territorial dispute and the territorial issues. That's not the case. And that is where I would agree with the Indian elites that agreeing on, that engaging in BRI initiatives does not, it does bring advantages to Indian economy, of course, but it also brings Chinese technical standards for infrastructure. There's technical standards, they are for years to come, for dozens of years to come. And as I get Indian goal setting, strategic goal setting, India wants to have coherent and independent model of development based on its own technological sector, innovations, so on and so forth. That is why I think Indian elites do not engage in the BRI, not because of Gilgit-Baltistan issue or whatever. And when it comes to Pakistan, I'm again impressed by your perspective on Pakistan. Very well balanced, very good knowledge of Pakistan without biases, and I do not see it as a weapon of China as well, but a very complex country with with very complex self-vision and vision of the subcontinent and the outer space. And actually, I don't think that there could be some reconciliation between India or Pakistan in years to come, because that is where identity comes first as well. and Pakistan's identity is based on all those issues, of course, you know, and on competing.
And it was built as an anti-Indian.
I would say that it is being built as a fortress sieged by India, how Pakistanis view the world, right? And I don't think that Pakistanis want to see themselves as anti-India, but Pakistanis elites do enjoy their feeling of being sieged by India, that perpetrates their staying in power. So, and that is the base on what their identity is built, and that is why I would not agree with you that there is no nationalism in Pakistan. Nationalism in Pakistan is based on this feeling of being sieged, not of being anti-India, but being an entity that is oppressed by India and by other external factors. So, sorry for a long talk, but I wanted to share my views on your book, by which I was really impressed, I should say.
Thank you. Thank you.
Could you please press the button again when speaking, because your mic doesn't seem to be working for our recording.
Yeah.
Would you like to comment back on what Mr. Gleb said?
No, I would say in a very broad sense that the difference between India and China on one hand and Russia on the other is that all countries have transactional and opportunistic and optics-driven relationships. But it is more in the case of India and China. Especially when it comes to dealing with the US. For instance, now, just as a re-engagement looks possible between India and China, you have Jake Sullivan who's gone and he's met Xi Jinping. So, China doesn't want to be left out of the dialogue process. And I have always, as in my book in the last chapter said, US only expresses verbal hostility to China. There is no hostility on the ground in what these two countries are doing, because both are in a kind driven by business objectives, economic considerations. And for instance, I could see it because this TV channel where I was working, I used to cover a lot of foreign things. One of the things I covered for a whole year was the US attempt at a coup in Venezuela. For instance, China did not take a stand against the coup, because it has business interests to protect them. Now, the same thing in Ukraine, which I have said in one of my pieces later, when China has appointed a special envoy for peace, that China has business interests there. So, it is not, China would not take the kind of position that Russia has taken against the US, for instance, in Syria. You know, you would not have that kind of thing. But this kind of flux will remain till one knows in which direction clearly things are moving. And there might be some clarity when maybe after the US elections, because there is a general expectation after the elections, new president comes end of January, maybe by next spring, the war will end in Ukraine or whatever. This is one aspect. The second thing, more important, is that these views, whether it is Lydia's or yours that I'm hearing it here. One does not hear these views in India, and it will be very interesting to hear more of this, the discussion of Russia, India, China, to hear more of this in India and have more visibility of what is going on between these two countries. So this is something that I feel very strongly. And I feel that even as things stand, one can still choose a particular ribbon of cooperation for India, China and Russia. For instance, I've traveled to parts of Eurasia. I've also traveled to Xinjiang. And one of the problems I see, it could develop, it may not develop, is that you have a lot of these ISIS trained and these jihadis slowly creeping into Central Asia. You know, so I look at Russia-China cooperation, especially along Xinjiang and these Eurasian states, as trying to kind of fence this area against these elements who will kind of destabilize the political and economic situation. And to do that, you need a lot of economic activity, offering, you know, space for entrepreneurs, employment, and so on, which is being done there. So, there perhaps, because one of India's favorite themes at most conferences has been terrorism. So, why don't we look, for instance, at terrorism in this area, where Russia, India, and China have common stakes, you know? Because you've had instances where people are there in this part, and it's still very vulnerable because of what Central Asia is. You know? So, that is what I would suggest. So, I'm just looking at what kind of threats could be taken forward to increase the visibility of both Russia-India relationship and Russia, India, and China. Because I used to see a lot of this years ago. I think Mr. Vinay Shukla must have also seen it. But now we don't have anything along those lines, you know.
Probably whenever India suggests a discussion like that,
Sorry?
Whenever India suggests a discussion like that, it will be welcomed by Russia. It's not for us to propose a discussion like this, to hold it in India, it's too sensitive. So, but we'll gladly come forward.
So, but you have a large number of Indologists and sinologists in Russia, you know, people who are working on this. And with Russia, the association is so much longer than with so many other countries. So I think at one time it was visible when you had this House of Soviet Culture and this libraries and all these conferences, the non-aligned movement and all those things, All India Peace and Solidarity. So a number of these things which were also influences on state policy, or at least giving inputs for state policy, they have all disappeared.
At the same time, with regard to Central Asia, I think that when one hears the notion in this country, the first thing that comes to mind is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Sorry, I didn't follow.
The first thing that comes to mind when we speak about Central Asia is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a multilateral platform where both India, Russia, and China are present. And what we see actually is that during the summit, for example, in July, Prime Minister Modi doesn't visit the summit. Right? So not only, but it was India was represented by Foreign Minister Jaishankar, which is a completely different level of the dialogue. Maybe the time is just not right for the high-level dialogue there, but at the same time, given the transformational nature of Eurasian processes these days, maybe it's the SCO exactly where all the three nations could at least try to even their vision of balance in Eurasia, and at the same time have Central Asian powers at the table. Because while speaking about Central Asia, we kind of have this like colonial discourse, like where China and Russia, or India and Russia, or India, China and Russia all decide about how Eurasian security and Central Asian security, even though if it's terrorism, can be decided. And so this is where we, for example, at RIAC see a lot of potential, and we are currently working on that, on trying to reestablish and rethink the role of the SCO to probably depoliticize it, if it was politicized, to also de-Russia-Chinize it in a way, because it was largely seen as a 5+2 format about Central Asia. It was invented as such, but now since 10 powers are there, maybe multilateral platforms as such are inevitable in order to be part of the discussion. I know that Anastasia from Higher School of Economics read your book very carefully. Probably, Anastasia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I guess I've read your book too carefully, and that's why I'm afraid I have too many comments, but I will try to be short. So I'm also another fan, I guess, from Russia, because I've got a lot of pressure, not pressure, but pleasure, of course, while reading your book. And as I'm the only sinologist here, I decided to focus on just two parts and to give the floor to my colleagues on the rest of them. So I've chosen the first one, which is actually about China and its internal processes, and I guess my input here would be the most obvious, and also about international role of China and maybe your vision and Indian perspective on it. So you've actually mentioned that it would be interesting to compare views in China, Russia, and India, and in the Russian sinologist community there is also a big event right now, because one of the Russian sinologists has just issued also a book which is dedicated to China, and the thing that I'm mentioning in this topic is because you have an interesting chronology if we take Russian perspective. Yes. Because your chronology starts from 2008, which is basically Hu Jintao's era, and you combine the texts together. And what we see actually not maybe only in Russia but also internationally, that Xi Jinping's period is divided from the rest, and it's compared to, for instance, Deng Xiaoping's era, that is completely different. And also, I guess the two important years, so the book ends up in the events of 2022, and actually there are quite many important events that happened to China after opening up after COVID, and this China is completely different in many aspects. From the China you are describing, for instance, the regulations towards cybersecurity sphere that you are analyzing there is completely different, and Chinese IT tycoons are in totally different conditions right now. Also, there is completely different environment for expats and for foreigners if we compare, because I was in China in the years that you are describing. I studied there from 2010 and 11 and also visited several times, so I had nostalgic feelings, I guess, because I remember many things. Many people who studied China remember these times, but now I guess there are more complicated times for foreigners and for integrating into Chinese environments that were during that particular period. Also, you are describing, for instance, corruption campaign, and mostly you focus on tigers there, so on top officials and like Bosilay's case. And we in Russia also see that it's like not tigers but also flies. So in Russian perspective, it's a more complicated phenomena, and it is connected also to the fact that Chinese governments needed more legitimacy. So because growth is the legitimacy based on economic growth and economic success was coming to the end, and then the party needed some new instruments in this regard. As for media, you described many things, and I actually was impressed by the beginning when you brought the insights from different agencies. And I think what is also important from the recent years is that Confucius Institutes are actually not really doing their way as before, and they had to close their representations in many countries, including the United States. I'm just, I was mentioning all these things just to ask you a question. First of all, how you feel these tendencies in China, in India? Do you feel that you are dealing with a different partner, or this is not really stressed out? For instance, the role of Xi Jinping as a leader, because there are many ideas that are associated with this leader, and maybe toughness of China in foreign affairs as well. So, what is your perception here? That would be maybe the question about internal politics, and also as for foreign affairs, I would like to mention, I guess, we've talked a little bit about Belt and Road Initiative, which is one of the leading Xi Jinping's projects. But also Xi Jinping promotes many other ideas, such as community of common destiny, and there are also global initiatives that were issued in from 2021 to 2023, like for development, for security, and for civilization. So what is your opinion on Chinese ideas and what they call discursive power? Do you believe that Chinese are really influencing the agenda, or is just or this attempt is not really working? What would be your perception and your view? Because we see that China is promoting artificial intelligence, again, development, South-South cooperation, so how all this is perceived in India. I guess that will stop here. Maybe if time permits, ask my other questions. Thank you.
No, one thought it triggers in me, which I haven't mentioned, and I think you've come close to that, is that when we are talking of India-China relationship, we are only talking of geopolitics, the militarized and the financialized and the trade thing. Whereas historically that has not been the case of India's relationship either with the United States or with the Soviet Union or Russia. And with China too, there was a dialogue process going on, something called Beijing Dialogues. And you had eminent social scientists, humanities scholars, one of whom is Homi Bhabha, who is I think consultant to the president of Harvard on humanities. He's a very big name in humanities. Then you had an art critic called Geeta Kapoor, who is also a politically very evolved person, who's written a book on 6 Indian artists many, many years ago. It's a kind of a thing which shows great depth of understanding. So then you had one other person, I forgot his name. So they used to have this 3-4 people who meet, say 1 week in Beijing, 1 week in India, and they discuss, what is happening in these societies, what is happening in these cultures. So, for instance, I read some of those things. I couldn't get those. They are published like small booklets, half in Mandarin and half in English. One of the discussions there is how, like, China is supposed to be a centralized administration, but the Chinese provinces have greater federal autonomy than many Indian states. Indian states don't have the federal autonomy that Chinese provinces have. For instance, Yunnan has a foreign affairs department because it shares the border with India and Myanmar and Bangladesh and so on. And they conduct their own relationship and things. I'm sure there is within the broader architecture of the party-led government, framed policies. The other thing is, they also discuss politics in terms of federalism, something which would never occur to us in India. Like one of the more authoritarian chief ministers we had, a very literate woman called Jayalalitha, who was a film star. She was the chief minister of Tamil Nadu, exceptionally powerful, and even kind of would be dismissive of prime ministers and everything. So when I was reading this dialogue, I felt the Chinese devoted a lot of time to that. They said, no, but you look at India's political federalism, it allows the rise of such people, whose powers transcend even that of the center in their respective territories, not only in domestic politics, but they also dictated what should be India's policy towards Sri Lanka. And she actually barred Sri Lankan generals and all coming to India for training. And actually the Constitution of India lays down that all the neighboring languages one should be able to learn in India. But nowhere in India is Sinhala taught. So this kind of thing, these dialogues were going on, philosophical, cultural. And for instance, then the other thing is that China has come to terms with, let us say, yoga. It has come to terms with Tagore, because Tagore was a very complex thing when he had traveled from Japan to China after getting the Nobel Prize. And that's also partly because you had this whole conflict between science and society at that time in China. But has China come to terms with Nehru? And what are the salient issues when you debate whether China has come to terms with this thing? Then you also have Buddhism, So these kind of discussions were taking place, which make for kind of, it's a very, interlacing kind of societal dialogue, which keeps a lot of traffic and movement, which is kind of now pushed under something very banal like people-to-people relationship, you know. Where you have this powerful tracks from Russia.
When there was a conflict, like border conflict that you also described in your book, when we were tracking this conflict from Chinese side, what actually we noticed is that China, of course, China made political statements, but China imposed not very much practical things in terms of measures. And in Indian case, the situation was, at least it looked like that, that India prohibited apps and there was a pause in cooperation. However, if we take the year 2022-2023, there is a rise of turnover, all positive trends that we discussed. So that's why I was asking, because on the one hand, China is blamed for World War and diplomacy, but on the other, we see that if there is a real escalation, China actually doesn't always fit into it, and it was kind of trying to stick to the status quo, and that's why I was. It was interesting for me to know how you view it.
There is also a lot of commercial interest. I think you mentioned it, or even see, for instance, banning all these apps and all that is many people feel that they might make a lot of noise about it. You know, might try to kind of stir nationalistic this thing, jingoistic thing. Oh, see, we banned Chinese apps, but these are probably to help somebody else. You know, some other company which is getting into this. Second, I don't understand the purpose of banning something like TikTok. TikTok might be a Chinese enterprise, it began. But in Delhi, how many of you have been here to Delhi? You have been?
Once.
Yeah. So, in this Connaught Place area where you have that theatre, plaza and Odeon and all, there is a whole street where every day hundreds of people used to be there shooting these TikTok. Now, it is they who have been put out of job. It's not the Chinese, they don't suffer in any way. So, in striking out at many Chinese enterprises and so on, it is Indian industry, Indian employment, Indian entrepreneurship that has been affected. There is no study. Now, I doubt whether anybody will conduct a study because it will not be very popular to take up something like this. People will just look for political signals, be happy if they can. The second thing, that one of the persons I have referred to and acknowledged is a man called Vijay Mishra in my piece. He's a businessman and he's also close to the ruling party. And one of the things he's been importing from China, or he's been trying to import, is technology. Now, I'm really amazed that there's been a lot of discussion. When you discuss technology today, it means only military equipment, what can be manufactured, what cannot be manufactured, defense equipment. Otherwise, there is no other discussion of technology. And although the original interest in China began with Joseph Needham's pioneering work, Science and Civilization, and from science flows technology, there is, I don't know how much of it is there in Russia or in the US, I'm sure there is a lot of interest in. But in India, there has been no discussion, no debate, nothing to enlighten us on technology in China, why or whether there could be a partnership or why it cannot be there. But this man tells me, and he is not a great philosophical or person who looks at that. He says, no, we get internet in a cheaper thing, at 1/3 the price of what we are paying now. But he says, nobody will even look at it here. We can't even propose the idea. It's become that bad. So we have these things. So I think one way of opening up would be opening up more channels of conversation. When I first went to Beijing, there were 3,000 people. By the time I came after my last assignment, there were more than 35,000 students there studying medicine and so many subjects. And China itself has changed, you know, because civilizationally, in cultural terms, China is not as adapting as the European, you know, to absorbing and things like that. So, for instance, even if I would say, no, I'm particular what kind of, no, we have Chinese, which means everything is there for everybody. So, they would not understand that for a vegetarian, it doesn't mean vegetable just boiled, it needs to be different, you know, very difficult for them to see those things. And once I was there were 4 or 5 vegetarians. So, they said, can we sit separately? Then the Chinese said, no, we can't allow that. You may not eat what we eat, but You can't
Actually,
tell us.
I have encountered these processes after COVID.
Yes,
That's
yes.
yeah.
So
They had, you know, in some places, at least
yes,
in big cities, they
yeah.
had.
So these kind of things, there is a lot of Chinese resistance to kind of enabling assimilation, you know, of the outsider. So, but they have changed remarkably, because some of you might know conditions in China, how bad they were for college students. You would have long rows, like maybe a row like this. They would have 2-3 people to a room in the hostel, and there would be only toilets there. For bath, you have to go to a bathhouse and pay to, you want to have a bath or a shower. Those were there till even 2010 and 12, you know. And even now, somebody in the global time, young woman say, so she says, no, they all come to my house on weekend because I have a shower at home. So, you know, this kind of thing is that it's seen as a privilege, it's changing. But this place in, I think it's Hangzhou or the province, where they have a lot of Indians now who are going to study international relations and everything. It is Changsha. No, the province name I forget. So I said, but what about food?
Zhejiang University, right?
Yeah. They said no.
Yeah, it's one of the top.
They are now giving them ensuite rooms, between rooms with attached bathrooms, which they don't have for all the Chinese in the same courses. But for senior, which means I met one of the chaps, he's done his masters at Harvard International Relations, then he's come here to pursue his PhD. So he said it's much more convenient for me, I can get all the material wherever I want. And then they have these traditional kitchens that you have regular Chinese and halal. But now in many of these campuses, they have opened separate Indian kitchens, you know, to get. So I think China goes out of its way in these things. And even when working there, I found that when those of us who went from developing countries, they would pay our fares. They would pay our visa charges. But if there are people, let us say, even from a less wealthy country of Europe, like Portugal, no. That person has to pay their own residence permit. So sometimes I would ask them, but if you are fed up, why don't you go? No. If we leave, we'll have to pay that full money. Whereas these things didn't apply to us, you know. We would be picked up, we would be dropped to the airport, we would be given visas with us. So all with even Soviet Union and Russia used to extend these things, you know, to people from developing. So China has this thing. And there are so many Peruvians there, Nepalese are there. One economic trip, I went about 7-8 universities. Not a single place where there is at least not 2-3 Nepalis. Only in one place I found an Indian. So that guy has been there. So I said, only you are there. He said, nobody comes. I don't know why. In Bihar, teachers don't get salary. Students don't have teachers. Why can't we come here? So I said, how much does he get? He said, sir, how much do I need? We get food. We get free accommodation. Material we want for study is free. And he says, he gets 3,500 yuan a month. So he came to Beijing. I said, you can afford to come? He said, yes, I eat any food. My girlfriend is Italian, so she works in some other province. So they are able to meet every 3 months, 6 months in Beijing or wherever they want. He says, if you eat everything, if you get 3,500 yuan a month, it's hell of a lot of money when you don't have other expenses. Your medical expenses are taken care of. This should be something like 35,000-40,000 rupees in today's Indian conditions, which people don't. So actually none of these things are known to many Indians. And the other thing is, even I, as a middle class or a higher level of middle class person, found China highly affordable. My cost of living is less than 1/5 what it would be in Delhi. So these things are not known in India at all. This thing where you can't eat food there, you know, that kind of. Sorry.
No. It just shows how Delhi has evolved,
yes.
not how China has progressed in terms of.
No, it's evolving
so
now.
I wanted to ask you if there are still Indian journalists accredited in China. Is there direct reporting?
No. There is accreditation for Chinese, for foreign journalists in China. For Indian journalists, there has been a rule, unwritten rule, that if India has 3 journalists there, Chinese will have 3 journalists.
And what is the situation now?
Yeah.
No journalists from both sides? What is the situation?
No, like now there are no Indian journalists in Beijing who are accredited.
Okay.
The only Indian journalist who goes there is Anand Krishnan, who was there for the Hindu. He's also written a book on China. It's a good book, very good book actually. And he, 2 years back, I think 2 years back, he came to Beijing. I think he was there for 2 years. He came to Beijing. He said, yes, I eat any food. he was there for the Hindu, then he was there for India Today also for a while and doing their TV thing. Then he's come back to the Hindu, and he has now got a family visa because he's married to a Chinese person. But he doesn't write on that basis.
You see, we don't have Indian journalists in Russia.
Yeah.
So the coverage is always secondary.
Yes.
The secondary coverage of China in
Yes.
India and
Yeah.
the secondary coverage of Russia in
Yes.
India.
Yes.
It's no direct reporting.
So there are both seen and unseen restrictions on Indian journalists in China, which doesn't apply to Chinese journalists in India. Because an Indian journalist in China, like when I was there during that 60th anniversary and all that, they were scared that because on that day they had all these windows shut, the day they were going to have the parade October 1, you know, their national day, and somebody had got picked up. So said if anything happens, then nobody would know about it. So they always have to negotiate that when we write something, we cannot offend either the Indian mission here, nor can we offend the Chinese authorities. And if you don't go for the briefing and you write about something, then they say, but you were not at the briefing. See? And then I wanted to get accreditation because I was writing for Indian newspapers as well as Chinese. Then a friend of mine whom I knew from the time he was working in Taiwan, and I used to work for Taiwanese media, he was with Bloomberg in Hong Kong. He came to Beijing where he had been posted earlier for 8 years. So I asked him about getting accredited. He said, Shastri, don't get accreditation. Because if you get accreditation, you get this RFID tag. So they know where you have been. And he said, as long as they are not objecting to what you write, don't go and get the accreditation. You write what you are writing, you know. Otherwise they will say, why have you written about this? You are not there at this briefing, you know, or on what basis have you written? That kind of thing is there. So there are now there are no accredited Chinese correspondents in India or Indian correspondents in China. The last of them have kind of parted ways. There is a Sinha correspondent in Delhi, but he is of Indian origin.
The number of Russian correspondents in India is number of Russian correspondents in India is increasing. We get more and more direct.
No, actually correspondents are Russian. Now there are more Russian correspondents. At one time there were Indian correspondents in Sputnik also. Now they have rewrite people, but there are more correspondents. Also there is somebody for Russia today.
Yes.
But I don't think there are Indian correspondents in Russia.
No.
Did I? No.
I was the last one. 12 years ago, when I went, I resigned. Since then, no.
Why is this not being discussed?
No, the problem is that they said nothing or negative at the time. Because at that time there was no interest in Russia. I said Russia is finished.
Cannot some mechanism be created to overcome this? Because China, what they used to do, they used to invite Indian journalists for programs of 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. So these guys are there and they are reporting, you know. Like IANS had a person like that.
The same thing is happening in Russia also now.
Okay.
Because actually Russia was also not very interested in India. Because the new Russian journalists, they think India was a Soviet client. That is why when we go to Ukraine, they write negative about Modi and all that. They don't know India as such, except the people who, but they don't report.
Yeah. And the other thing that the government of India did.
I strongly encourage everyone to switch on the mics because we are recording due to our agreement and nobody has actually been doing that. I'm very sorry, but this strongly influences the discussion for us to reproduce afterwards. Yeah, I'm sorry.
So, thank you very much. In fact, I was deeply impressed by the book because I've never read from Indian writer something like that about China, so unbiased, in fact. And so I have 3 questions. First question is, so can you hear me? Maybe
louder.
Okay, a bit louder. So I would venture to say that I am quite well acquainted with Indian expert community, and I have impression that so there is a great deficiency of experts on China in Indian community. And in fact, so in Russia we have more experts on little North Korea or little South Korea than India has on China. And I will not name the person well, but I have an example of one of Indian sinologists who was he's a very great sinologist. He was absolutely unbiased expert, and he made a great successful career. But after that, he was hired by American think tank, and so he stopped to be unbiased Indian expert and became an unbiased American expert. Stop. No names. So is it only part to success?
Yes.
Or there is anyone? And so my second question is about, well, you mentioned that politicians usually avoid criticizing politicians usually avoid criticizing China directly, but in fact, the opposition avoids criticizing China, but criticize politicians, BJP politicians, on these actions on China for being too friendly, too soft.
On pollution.
Well. And so it's a way to get more political points before any elections. So don't you think that, in fact, so it's my own impression that, especially after Galvan, that the main force that pressed on Modi, that in fact tried to, to make the position of the government more tough. It was in fact urbanized, urbanized middle class, more chauvinistic, more patriotic, and in fact very, I would like to say, very frustrated, because it was during the COVID, and so they needed more and more news and more news about more visuals. Any more images from there, so they didn't risk anything. But in fact, so they were, from my point of view, the main driver for that. And so maybe the biased position of Indian media is just an answer on so this question of the middle class who wants, in fact, who is accustomed to anti-Chinese position, and so they want to get more and more information of this type.
Get more and more
information of this type.
Yeah.
And so my third question is, so it's very short. So what's the role of Indian military elites, on Indian generals and Indian general staff in this issue? Because in fact they are obvious beneficiaries of any problems with China, because they get so gratitude of society, they get bigger part of budget pie. So do they play any role in this xenophobic discourse in India? Thank you.
No, I agree with most of what you said. Now, just to take one example, this pollution thing. When I first went to work in Beijing in 2009 and 10, pollution was very high. And then the Americans had built their new embassy, and they had every day an air quality. This, you might remember that. So every day they were putting it out, and they said this is not a travel advisory. But interestingly, when I returned to Beijing in 2015 and 16, the air in Beijing was far, far better than it is in Delhi today. So I think these have certain spin-off effects. Second thing, on the information thing also, I think India, of course, you can get whatever information you want. It's not very difficult. There are people available. You can speak, sources, specialists, everything. But China also is not so difficult. Like, the sources of the information are the same. Whether you are a scholar, whether you are a journalist, whether you are an intelligence agent, you may talk to some political people. But you go through these things meticulously, like you go through Xinhua, you go through People's Daily, you read all the references in the annual report of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences report. Then you know where the unrest events have been over the year. So it is possible, but there is a large amount of tightening of this post 2012. It didn't happen immediately, but post 2000, from 17 onwards, it has been tighter and tighter. And then getting in foreigners now. Earlier, almost all the foreigners who were employed was getting at least 5 times the salary of the Chinese people who were employed, although they had the authority. But now they don't employ. When I went, last time I met somebody in 2020, they say no, they get 7 days leave in a year, and which was not the case earlier. It was 22 days, you could go and come. And I think it's only Sinhua which has a large number. So I think even though the areas of interaction are expanding in terms of business and technology, how does one describe these? These are these traditional institutional spaces, you know, of media and all these things. These are kind of declining. But do you have difficulties here getting information on China? Do you have difficulties here getting information on China?
No, in fact not, because so my wife was born in China and she teaches Chinese language in Moscow University, so I do not have any problem. And so it's, she's Russian. She's Russian.
Okay.
It's not a problem to get some books, for example, through our embassies or consulates in China. And so, you know, they publish usually so-called yellow and blue books on special issues on Central Asia, for example, on not on Tibet, of course, but on their position, traditional white book on the defense and security issues, and so on, so on. No, we do not have any problem with it, and so now it's maybe the main source of information. Surprisingly for us, it's Weibo. Because you can read a lot of interesting opinions of ordinary Chinese people, and so sometimes it gives you some, not ideas, well, but some impression of Chinese public opinion on some things. What I was surprised, in fact, about China and India, that in India, so war of 1962 is one of pillars of national news. In China, it's almost forgotten, because I tried to find any book in China, being in China, in Harbin, in Beijing, in Shanghai, to find any book about this war. Absolutely nothing, because last of these books were published in 2002.
Have all of you been to China as well? Yes. All of you? Yeah. So you devote equal time to both the countries in your studies when you look at China-India relationship, or?
I lived in India for over 10 years.
You worked in China for 10 years?
In India.
Okay, okay.
But China is just occasional visits.
Okay.
There is no comparison.
Where were you working in India?
In Delhi, in an Indian company with an Indian family called Sangroup, the Kemka family.
Okay.
Started with the embassy.
Okay.
Delhi person.
Okay.
Which probably you spent some time in China.
Well, I guess that's another issue. I mean, it's an issue of censorship in the Chinese media space and generally, and maybe also political language that they use. I know that that's why many of the prohibited terms have their very tricky names, how you can find them, or discussions. For instance, they could be written in numbers, like numbers and incident, and that's how you might try to find them. And also they use characters as homonyms. And for instance, I know that in Chinese media space, harmonious society, which was an ideological term of Hu Jintao's era, they wrote it in characters with another meaning, which meant, if I'm not mistaken in translation, is some kind of a river crabs. And that's why one of the dissidents in China, his name is Ai Weiwei, he made an installation made of these river crabs, and there was kind of a discussion on that. So that is, I guess, an interesting issue. And I think that maybe sinologists had some problems to get articles in Chinese, but in recent years, special military operations, as Russia was distracted or kind of from Western sources, articles, and so on. We got at least HSE University has access to Chinese databases, and I guess in this field, new political reality provide even more information to sinologists than we had before.
But that's in Chinese, right?
First of all, we had in English, and I think now we have in Chinese, and I also know that in Inuan they also have. Well, it may be open for a month or so, so it's maybe not regular, but there are more and more attempts in Russia to be a part of these databases.
Okay.
Yes, we use the basis. Fantastic.
So, dear colleagues who haven't spoken yet, Leyla, Alexey,
Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to congratulate you on the book. I think it's an important one. It's an important contribution to the debate that exists in India on China. And from my perspective and from my experience, it's really rare to hear and read Indian experts trying to come up with an impartial analysis of India-China relationship. China issue and China-related issues come up often during discussions and debates. I spent 4 months last year in Delhi, and whether it's like the visit of ambassador from Latin America or any other country, there will be a China question. It's a must for the Indian audience, but it always fits into some narrative, and I think that you highlighted it very well in your final chapter of the book, that the media coverage and the public discussion influence the perception of China in India. But I would like to pose 2 quite specific questions. The first one, could you share your perspective, your view on the current state of affairs along the line of actual control? Sorry?
My view on
your view on the state of affairs along the LAC, line of actual control?
Situation.
Actual situation on the line of control.
On the line of control.
Line of actual control.
Actual control.
Not
Line of
line of
actual
control.
Yeah.
LAC, yeah.
No, see, actually, one of the best persons to read on this is Shyamsaran.
Yeah.
And the other person who's done a lot of work on this is a person called Prem Shankar Jha. So you might find some of his pieces in the wire. Now, 2 things. One is the line of actual control, LAC. At one time, it was both the armies were 15-16 kilometers apart. Then slowly they have closed in on the area. Now they are almost eyeball to eyeball after Galwan. So this is a huge strain on the resources of the army as well as the government and things like that, equipment and thermal wear and things like that. It also heightens tensions. And there is no fixed line because where the water flows, part of it may be because the river is there where the water flows, the river is this side when it flows this way. And when Mr. Shyamsaran was the foreign secretary, he tried to map the LAC on the ground and he found that this is not possible. Even in the northern region, forget the eastern region. This is first thing. Second thing about the LAC, what I would say is that neither side is willing to think out of the box. There are possibilities, there are solutions. If one at least begins talking about it. Like I remember the case when Abe and Putin had a meeting over the northern territories. Then they said we'll have joint development, which at least gave the quietus to the whole controversy. Joint development may or may not happen, that is a different thing. Like Abe is dead and gone. Okay, we don't know whether future leadership of Japan would look at it. But the very fact that one can talk of joint development, which means the nationalistic impulses are then reined in on both sides. That does not become a central fact for consideration. So this could have been possible had BCIM been there, because when Pranab Mukherjee at a meeting, I was there in Gangtok, he said, we want peace on the periphery and progress and development at the center. So what does it mean? So people said, you need to show greater regard for people who are on the periphery. So the people of Bangladesh, China, India and Myanmar, who say are at a meeting point, there's a small area where they come together, their habits, their food, the crops they harvest, the clothes they wear, the things they do, the language they speak, these all have more in common than between Delhi and Beijing, or Delhi and Myanmar or Dhaka also. So when it was conceived of, it was felt that this might at least reduce hostility, it might encourage kind of movement and things like that. So that is the first part. Second thing is you need political conditions, you need a political leadership which can sell something like that. No matter when you come to terms and have a boundary agreement, there is going to be criticism. Okay, no matter what the terms of the agreement. So it depends on what the political leader can sell. Now, for instance, Vajpayee was remarkably successful. After the attack on Mumbai, he went to Pakistan. Which other Indian Prime Minister could have done it? He went to Pakistan and then he said, in Lahore, he said, this shows that we have to talk more. See, that is an exceptional development. Now, and the thing is, he did not alienate any of the opposition parties. He did not spend a single word or a minute in criticizing any of the other parties. He carried all of them with him, and they were also silent when it was Vajpayee's initiative, whether it was on Kashmir or on Pakistan. So you need a leadership like that, which will rise above one-upmanship, and which will carry all the parties, because otherwise it can create huge discontent. So that is one. Then the other thing, so first you have where is the line of actual control? It is undefined. Okay. Whenever you are going to have it, it is not going to be defined at all. It is going to be a political settlement. Political settlement means give and take. And always both countries will say there has been more give than take. In China there may be no such debate, but in India it will be there, it will go on election after election. So it cannot be done unless the person has that political sense. Vajpayee might not have understood much about international affairs, but he was a very, very sharp political animal. He knew what had to be done with Pakistan from the viewpoint of Indian politics. And he kind of had all the political parties firmly behind him on that issue. So I doubt whether that will happen now. It will take a long time for that to happen in India. And then there's one other issue I wanted to say about the LAC. See, what China has more than once proposed, what you say, that you accept what is there. That is never, from the time of Chow and Lai, they have said you accept it. No, they will not accept status quo. It is not possible. And the other thing now is the Prime Minister is on record as having said in Parliament, neither has anybody come nor has anybody occupied. So the question being asked, then what are the 16, 17 rounds of military talks being held about? So the first thing is you have to acknowledge on record. But this is like the Henderson report on the boundary issue. Everybody has a copy of that report. You will find it in Moscow, Beijing, Delhi. But as long as the government does not place it in Parliament, it is not accepted as an official document. In the same way, you will first have to acknowledge that there is a boundary problem. What is the problem? What are the terms of engagement? That is not going to happen from the Indian side for a long time.
And the second question, it may sound a bit provocative.
What did you have in mind? Did you think that there could be any negotiated solution in the near future?
I mean, from my perspective, the current situation is that diplomatically it is more or less sorted out. At least, I mean, it's like in a frozen state. But from the military point of view, it will take much time. I think that in your book you make references to 2013 Depsan crisis, to 1986, 1987 situation, which took a lot of time to sort out from the military perspective. So I think that it may take a long time for the military, for both sides to agree on something. But diplomatically, I think that there is an intention from both sides to move on and probably put aside this tricky situation. So the second question is on India's approach to Taiwan. Do you think that there are some changes over the last 2-3 years? Changes. Do you think that this approach is changing after Galwan? Because I mean, again, from my own observation, you mentioned economic track, which is important. There is more investment from the from the companies like Foxconn, you mentioned this. But there are also more and more discussions at the second track level, which I guess would not be possible without the approval from the Indian government. And do you think that it's indicative of any change of approach or India's, New Delhi's attempt to test the Chinese reaction or with regard to this context?
Now, I don't know how many people here have read Dai Bingo's book on the boundary issue. Has anybody read the thing? Dai Bingo, I haven't read the book. I had raised some questions to interview him for China-India dialogue. By the time they went to him, did the interview, and it was published, I had left the place. It happened about 4 or 5 months after I left. See, Dai Bingo's book says that whatever had to be discussed on the boundary issue has been discussed during Vajpayee's time, even before Vajpayee completed his term. He says this thing which they call special representative boundary talks, he says there is no such thing any longer. They call it that. It has basically become a ministerial meeting every year. He says it is meaningless. And this has not been contested by anybody in India. So this is just an annual ritual. What has been done in the last now, almost 20 years since Vajpayee went, nothing has been achieved. The only thing is we have gone down further with this Galwan thing. And Galwan, the facts are still not clear. When this is not clear means the government is yet to kind of place on record in Parliament what is the situation, what is the requirement, and what are the expectations. And that will not come. At least in India, the political situation is still very, very volatile. And any strength and great strength, exceptional strength that Prime Minister Modi had is now over with the last election. Today he is dependent on multiple forces at home and also abroad to move. The India-China boundary issue, if it could have been solved only by India and China, it would have happened long ago. But there are so many other factors at play. It won't happen very easily. I definitely don't see it happening while Mr. Modi and Xi Jinping are at the helm of their respective governments. I don't see it happening.
But they agree to put it aside for a time.
Actually, everybody now agrees that was the best thing Manmohan Singh did. The best thing beginning with Rajiv Gandhi that was done is let us look at economics, technology, cooperation, education, people going there for education. We had Mandarin in schools, but after Galwan they stopped the teaching of Mandarin. What has learning the Chinese language got to do with a military conflict in Galwan? I don't understand that. But they have stopped the teaching of the language in schools. So all these things, and then you ban these Chinese apps. Who has lost because of all these things? So, and as Gokhale says, the less you talk, the less the interaction, the less you will know. Especially about China. The more you talk, the more people you have, the more you are likely to learn. But now, there has been some resumption of dialogue because some retired diplomats and all, they have been called, people I know, they have gone twice in the last year. So for think tank interactions and everything. Now I think later this year they are planning to then call some journalists also. They had not called any of them. Then they had invited a couple of political people for the anniversary of that Panchsheel. And Xi Jinping himself was there at that meeting. So some political people they had invited from India. So these things are slowly on the sidelines, things are happening. So there is some conversation that is going on.
And concerning Taiwan? Taiwan? Any changes?
Have I?
Any changes in this approach?
There is a mention in the book, yes. You are saying, have I said anything in the book?
No. I mean, do you? What is your observation? Have there been any changes in this approach?
Has there been a change in India's position on Taiwan?
In whose position?
India's position.
No, there has been no change. They are still saying we are continuing talks. The military commanders are talking. No. And change is there.
There
are changes because the foreign minister has
he's asking Taiwan.
One is Taiwan. The other important change is
my Chinese is bad.
Earlier all the other countries, including the US, were speaking on China in Delhi. and in the US. Now, Jaishankar has said we have a problem with China. It is for us to talk to them. There is no call for everybody else to pitch in with what they have to say. That is the first thing. Second thing is not only Taiwan, Tibet also. On Tibet, the US has become very active after the passing of the congressional bill on freedom for Tibet. And when they become active, that means they will goad the Dalai Lama to take a more inflexible position against China. And that will put pressure on him, because as long as he is on Indian soil, there are a lot of restrictions on him. He cannot carry out political activity. But he's been having these visitors, especially provocative visitors like Nancy Pelosi and so on. And then again, Taiwan also. And there is a section in India which believes that we should have a relationship with Taiwan. I think it is absurd. It's really absurd. You cannot equate Taiwan with China. But there is, see, now what has happened is foreign policy is decided on social media. For instance, when Prime Minister Modi went to the Lakshadweep Islands, and he said, no, it's a challenge to tourism in Maldives, people said. And they said 70 lakh Indians are opposed to Maldives. I don't think 70 lakh Indians even know where is Maldives, how many islands it is. You know, Maldives, each island has about 900 to 1000 beds for tourists. Lakshadweep, I don't think it has even 250 beds for tourists. It does not even have a regular airport. So this kind of trolling, you know, and same thing with China, you find a lot of things. So to keep this clutter aside, this is what dominates the air. Discussions are happening in quiet places like the India International Center or Indian Council of World Affairs or places like this, which doesn't have any public impact, you know. Public impact, you find municipal elections in Delhi, people are talking about China. What has it got to do with that? So, I don't see that there will be any change anytime soon. And I am strongly convinced that this is China's has established deterrence against India. And nobody wants to admit. Who will admit it? They would never admit it. How will they admit it? Jaishankar has indirectly admitted it. I have deliberately not put it in my book. He says, yes, they have come across, but we can't go to war against them. They are 3 times our size. Do you expect me to go to war against them? What does it mean? If he throws up his hands, it amounts to that the fact of deterrence has been established, you know. And there's one thing that when China carries out anything like that, China does that and then moves back. It is not followed by torrents of words and noises and papers and things like that which go on for months together. Whereas that is not the case in India. You know, Galwan is still being talked about. Every time somebody says dialogue with China, they will say Galwan, they will say WeChat, this kind of thing. So this thing is going on, and it's hard to say whether when they will move away from it. They won't move away from it. Even 62, till Galwan they went on about 62. No, how does it look here in Moscow to you?
Yeah.
You mean which?
Yeah. Do you think, at least they, as she said, leave this aside, let us get on with whatever we can on other tracks. Even will that happen?
It's difficult to say.
Trade alone, if it begins now, that might be a big game, you know.
Dear colleagues, I suggest that we thank Mr. Ramachandran for his insight and drew the line under the official discussion here and switch it to the to that space where coffee is and biscuits are, because I believe that many of us need a little energy boost by the end of the day. So, Mr. Ramachandran, thank you very much for coming here and so this is what we at RIAC value very highly, as well as the topics that are usually on the sidelines of official discussions between the leaders and the public community. And we also thank all our guests for coming here today, for finding the time and being as invested into discussion as you were. And so in case there are any other questions to Mr. Ramachandran, please feel free to stay and ask them as part of the coffee break. Thank you.